Christmas Eve, 1975. The Isle of Mull, Scotland. 54-year-old Peter Gibbs, a former RAF pilot and World War II veteran, has dinner with his girlfriend at the Glenforsa Hotel, but decides to go on an evening flight. After taking off from an adjacent airfield in a Cessna, Gibbs never returns. 4 months later, Gibbs' body is discovered on a hill 1 mile from the hotel, and his cause of death is determined to be exposure. But the missing aircraft is never found. While a diver supposedly spots wreckage of the Cessna in the water a decade later, there is still no explanation for how Gibbs wound up dead on the hill, and the Great Mull Air Mystery is never solved. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring one of the most bizarre stories we've ever covered, the Great Mull Air Mystery. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Alexandra Wasilicia, the latest winner of our Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, and she did a tremendous job, so thank you very much, Alexandra. As you probably know, this is a recurring monthly contest, and if you'd like to enter it, I will be providing instructions about how to do so at the end of this episode. Anyway, throughout the month of December, we've been releasing episodes about unsolved mysteries which took place around Christmas time, and this particular story involves a former Royal Air Force pilot named Peter Gibbs, who decided to take an evening flight on Scotland's Isle of Mull on Christmas Eve, but never returned alive. Usually, when an aircraft goes missing near a body of water, it's pretty easy to figure out what happened. However, this particular story is pretty unique in that the plane was never found, but the pilot was, as Gibbs' dead body was discovered on a hill months later. The initial theory was that Gibbs may have crashed his plane into the water, swam to shore, and subsequently died of exposure, but there are a number of odd discrepancies to suggest that might not actually be the case. This is one hell of a baffling mystery, as it's very difficult to come up with an airtight theory about what happened, which makes 100% complete sense. So I think this is an ideal choice for our last featured case of 2018. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the Great Mull Air Mystery. Our story begins in Scotland in 1975. Our central figure is 54-year-old Norman Peter Gibbs, who goes by the name Peter and lives in London. Gibbs was a former fighter pilot with the No. 41 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, aka the RAF, and flew Spitfires during World War II. Following the war, Gibbs decided to pursue a career in music, and would play violin in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the London Symphony Orchestra, and the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. However, Gibbs never lost his passion for flying, obtaining a license to fly private aircraft, and accumulating over 2,000 hours of flying experience. He eventually became a property developer, and by 1975 was the managing director of his own firm, Gibbs & Ray. On December 21st, Gibbs traveled to the Isle of Mull, a 337 square mile mountainous island located off the west coast of Scotland. He was accompanied by his 32-year-old girlfriend, Felicity Granger, and the couple stayed at the Glenforsa Hotel. Gibbs rented a red and white Cessna F-150H aircraft from a local resident, which was housed at the hotel's adjacent Glenforsa airfield. He was looking to invest in possibly buying a hotel, and over the course of the next few days, would fly the Cessna to the surrounding islands in order to inspect property. On Christmas Eve, Gibbs and Granger had dinner together at the Glenforsa Hotel and consumed some whiskey and red wine when Gibbs suddenly decided that he had the urge to climb into the Cessna and take it up for a quick flight. This was quite an unusual proposal, as it was a very dark and moonless evening. Glenforsa Airfield did not have landing lights, and local regulations banned flights from taking place at night. However, Gibbs was interested in the idea of building his own hotel with an adjacent airstrip and wanted to demonstrate that nighttime flights were possible. While the hotel's staff advised Gibbs that this wasn't a good idea because a winter storm was approaching, he told them that he wasn't asking for their permission. Gibbs said the flight would only take around 5 minutes or so, and he decided to have Felicity Granger function as his makeshift landing light by placing 2 torches on the airstrip. The couple then left the hotel, and according to Granger, they climbed into the Cessna and taxied down the runway together. When they reached the end, Granger climbed out and placed 2 torches about a foot apart facing the aircraft. The Cessna took off at approximately 9:30 p.m. without any apparent issues, but unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Peter Gibbs was seen alive. Ironically, Christmas Day would have been Gibbs's 55th birthday. Granger waited around at the airfield for the next half hour and became concerned when the Cessna did not return. By this point, heavy sleet had begun to fall, which would last for the next 72 hours and made very poor visibility for flying. Granger subsequently returned to the hotel to inform them that Gibbs had not returned, and they contacted the police. Even though the Cessna was equipped with a radio, no one received any distress calls from him. When Gibbs still hadn't surfaced by Christmas morning, a full-scale search was launched. Hundreds of volunteers searched the entire island, and Royal Air Force and Navy service helicopters used sonar as they flew over the Sound of Mull, the body of water which separated the Isle of Mull from the mainland of Scotland. Residents of the coastal town of Oban recalled hearing the sound of a light aircraft as they were leaving a church service sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, but did not see anything. Unfortunately, the search effort was severely hampered by the winter storm, and it failed to turn up any sign of Gibbs or the missing Cessna. However, a surprising discovery would be made 4 months later. On April 21, 1976, a local shepherd was walking down a hill located approximately 1 mile from the Glenforsa Hotel when he came across Peter Gibbs's body lying on his back across a log. The location was about 400 feet up from the base of the hill, and Gibbs was described as almost resting peacefully. He was still wearing the clothing and flying boots he put on right before he took off on Christmas Eve, and the only injury was a superficial 3-inch cut on Gibbs's right leg. An autopsy found no traces of alcohol, drugs, or poison in Gibbs' body, and the medical examiner concluded that he was likely dead the entire 4 months he was missing. Without any noticeable signs of foul play, the cause of death was officially determined to be exposure. A fatal accident inquiry was held, and since the missing Cessna could still not be found, they thought it most likely that Gibbs accidentally crashed the aircraft into the Sound of Mull. It turned out that Gibbs's private pilot's license had expired in October of 1974, and he never bothered to renew it. During his last flying test, the examiner had ruled that Gibbs would need to wear spectacles whenever he piloted an aircraft, but Felicity Granger claimed that she never saw him wear glasses at all while he flew. It was also not unprecedented for Gibbs to have been involved in an aerial accident, as 16 years earlier, a Tiger Moth biplane he owned suffered engine failure, and he crashed it during a forced landing attempt. The inquiry concluded that Gibbs probably crashed the Cessna into the water before swimming to shore and attempting to walk back to the hotel, but he ultimately succumbed to hypothermia and exposure before he made it. However, there were a number of discrepancies which led people to believe the official explanation was not that simple. The hill where Gibbs was found had been searched following his disappearance, but they did not see his body there. Even after the initial search efforts concluded, the hill was constantly used by farmers and shepherds over the next 4 months, but even though he was lying out in the open on top of a log, no one noticed Gibbs until April. The location where Gibbs was found seemed to defy all logic, because if he had crashed the Cessna into the Sound of Mull and swam to shore, it would have required him to climb up a cliff face before reaching the road. If Gibbs had just followed the road, he could have made it back to the hotel, but he inexplicably decided to cross it instead and walk 400 feet uphill before he died. There was also doubt about whether Gibbs had even been in the water to begin with, as there were no traces of saltwater deposits or marine microorganisms on his skin or clothing, though the medical examiner tried to counter this by saying that 4 months of rain and snow could have washed all traces of the sea salt away. When Gibbs's body was found, it was also in surprisingly good condition after having been out in the elements for 4 months, as there was little decomposition or signs of animal predation, even though predators were known to often frequent that particular hill. Because of these discrepancies, an alternate theory was that Gibbs may have jumped out of the Cessna in mid-flight while it was still over land before it subsequently crashed into the water. According to Felicity Granger, right before taking off, Gibbs had told her that if anything went wrong, he would throttle the engine of his aircraft right back and jump to safety. However, the aircraft was not equipped with any parachutes, and as far as anyone knew, Gibbs did not bring his own. No parachutes were ever found, and it seemed hard to believe that Gibbs could have jumped out of the plane without one and not sustained any injuries more serious than a superficial cut on his leg. There was also some debate about whether an additional person could have been present when the Cessna took off from Glenforsa Airfield. While this occurred, the hotel turned off many of its lights so that everyone could get a better view of the takeoff in the darkness. Some of the witnesses thought the plane took an unusually long time to warm up on the runway and that its lane lights flashed on and off more times than normal before it took off. The brother of the hotel manager and his wife were also watching through binoculars and would claim they saw both torches on the airstrip being moved in opposite directions simultaneously, which seemed to suggest that another person besides Felicity Granger was out there. However, Granger always maintained that no one else was on the runway that night. The same couple also reported seeing what appeared to be a flare over the water on the Sound of Mull shortly after takeoff. In October of 1976, a farmer found an airplane tire on shore about 2 miles northwest of the Glenforsa Hotel, but while it appeared to be the same type of tire the Cessna used, it could not be conclusively determined if it belonged to the missing aircraft. For the next decade, there would be no trace of the Cessna until an interesting development took place in September of 1986. A professional diver named George Foster was underwater searching for scallops in the Sound of Mull when he claimed he came across what appeared to be a red and white Cessna. It was resting on the seabed 100 feet below the surface and approximately 500 meters from shore. The evidence suggested that the plane had been involved in a violent crash, as both of the wings had sheared off, one of the wheels was ripped off, and the engine was a short distance away from the aircraft. There didn't appear to be anyone in the cockpit, but there was a hole in the windscreen, and both of the cockpit doors were closed. Most interestingly, Foster claimed that he saw the plane's registration number G-AVTN, which matched the number on Peter Gibbs' Cessna. While Foster did take some photographs of the aircraft, they were too blurry to make out the registration number, so no one could say with absolute certainty that it was the same missing plane. While salvage teams performed a search of the Sound of Mull, they could not find the Cessna. In 2004, a trio of Royal Navy warships were testing equipment in the same area when they came across a wrecked aircraft 100 feet beneath the surface on the seabed. One of the ships deployed an underwater camera to take pictures of the wreckage, and it was eventually identified as a World War II-era RAF Catalina flying boat which had gone down during a training exercise in 1945. However, no one could be 100% certain if this was the same downed aircraft George Foster had come across, as he had described it as missing both of its wings, whereas the Catalina was only missing one wing. So after 4 decades, the Cessna is still officially missing, the exact circumstances of Peter Gibbs's death are still unexplained, and the Great Mull Air Mystery continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, there are a ton of unsolved mysteries out there involving missing aircraft, but this one really stands out among the pack because it's not often you'll find the body of the missing pilot, but not the plane. And if you do find the pilot's body, it will generally be in the water, not on land a great distance from shore. While the Great Mull Air Mystery is fairly famous in the United Kingdom, it doesn't seem to be all that well known in North America. There are a number of theories surrounding this case, some of them pretty outlandish, but one theory I'm kind of surprised doesn't get more traction is aliens. Quite frankly, when you look at all the evidence, the theory which would probably make the most sense is that Peter Gibbs and his Cessna were abducted by aliens. They held onto the aircraft, but after they killed Gibbs, the aliens dropped his body off on a hill 4 months later, which would explain why he was wearing the exact same clothing and why his body was in relatively good shape. This is actually kind of reminiscent of the 1986 Disney-produced sci-fi film Flight of the Navigator, which is a childhood favorite of mine. In that movie, a 12-year-old boy is abducted by an alien spacecraft and taken to another planet before he is dropped off back on Earth. However, even though they were only gone for a couple of hours, the spacecraft traveled at the speed of light, so 8 years actually passed on Earth before the kid was returned home, having not aged a day. It would be very tempting to say this is the exact thing which happened to Peter Gibbs, but this is not that type of podcast. Truth to be told, I only wanted an excuse to make a Flight of the Navigator reference. I highly recommend it, it's an underrated film. Anyway, once you disregard the idea of aliens, you have to come up with a logical, earthbound explanation for how Gibbs wound up dead on that hillside, and that's not an easy thing to do. This is one of those mysteries where no matter how hard you try, it's very difficult to come up with an airtight theory about what happened, which doesn't at least have some holes. But I'm going to try my best. Of course, one aspect of this story which has always baffled people is why Gibbs even decided to make this flight to begin with. Think about it. It's Christmas Eve, you're at a nice hotel having a relaxing dinner and some wine with your girlfriend, it's Christmas Day and your birthday tomorrow, and there's word that a winter storm is about to hit the area. What could possibly compel you to say, I feel like hopping into a plane and going flying in pitch black darkness before I land on a runway with no lights? I know Gibbs's rationale was that he was hoping to eventually build his own hotel with an adjacent airfield and wanted to demonstrate that taking off and landing at nighttime was a feasible option, but I don't quite get the logic here. If you really want to build an airstrip where nighttime flying can be done, then by all means, go ahead and build it, but install some landing lights. I just don't see what taking a plane into the air and landing in the dark with nothing but a pair of torches to assist you is supposed to prove. This is one of the reasons some people have speculated that there was a lot more to Gibbs's flight than he let on. There have been theories that Gibbs may have been involved in smuggling arms or diamonds, or that he was some sort of agent from MI5 going off on a secret mission. Well, I seriously doubt that Gibbs was involved in anything clandestine, for the simple reason that he called so much attention to himself. Once he announced that he was taking the plane up for an evening flight, the staff tried to talk him out of it, and virtually the entire hotel knew what was going on. Once Gibbs decided he was going to go flying anyway, the hotel turned many of its lights off so everyone could get a better view of the takeoff in the dark. If Gibbs was involved in smuggling or going off on some sort of secret mission, you couldn't find a less covert way to do so. But on the other hand, some people have suggested that perhaps Gibbs made a calculated decision to call as much attention to himself as possible, and that this so-called flight was an insurance scam gone horribly wrong. The local resident who rented out the Cessna to Gibbs was Ian Hamilton, and believe it or not, He was also involved in another infamous incident which took place at Christmas time. In the early morning hours of Christmas Day in 1950, Hamilton and 3 other Scottish nationalist students from the University of Glasgow stole the Stone of Scone, aka the Stone of Destiny, from Westminster Abbey in London. The stone had been taken by King Edward I during the Scottish Wars of Independence in the year 1296, and Hamilton and his friends thought it should be returned to its rightful home. The incident was a pretty big deal in Scotland at that time, which is why it's so amusing that Hamilton would be loosely linked to the Great Mull Air Mystery, which took place exactly 25 years later. Now, the main reason there's been speculation that a third person was involved in Gibbs's flight is because of the witnesses who thought they saw the 2 torches on the runway being moved simultaneously. Felicity Granger, which incidentally sounds like the name of a Harry Potter character, has always maintained that she was the only person out there that night, but it would have been impossible for her to move both torches in opposite directions at the same time. Technically, we do only have Granger's word that the takeoff went the way she said it did, as it was too dark for anyone at the hotel to clearly see what was going on from a distance. Witnesses also took note of the fact that the Cessna took an unusually long time to warm up, and that the lane lights flashed on and off before it went into the air. You could easily assume this was due to a struggle going on inside the plane, or that the aircraft was being flown by someone who was unfamiliar with the controls. A theory which has been presented is that Gibbs and Ian Hamilton colluded together on a scam in which they only wanted to give off the impression the plane took off and crashed in order to collect the insurance money. But something went wrong, and Gibbs was double-crossed, which is why he wound up dead on the hill months later. However, that seems pretty far-fetched. For one thing, there's no evidence whatsoever that Ian Hamilton was involved in anything nefarious, and a Cessna F-150H isn't exactly a large, lofty aircraft, so you're not going to get that much for it from an insurance payout. And of course, if someone else was with Gibbs when the plane took off and wound up murdering him, how exactly did they do it? Remember, there weren't any noticeable signs of foul play, and the cause of death was determined to be exposure. The alternate explanation which has been pushed forward about the 2 torches moving simultaneously is that the witnesses may have simply mistaken one of the torches for the plane's landing light, as it was very dark outside, and it would have been easy for their eyes to play tricks on them. As crazy as it sounds, Gibbs's claim that he wanted to take the plane into the air to test the feasibility of a night landing might have actually been true. That's not the most logical reasoning, but Gibbs was not always the most logical person. I mean, he was flying with a pilot's license which had been expired for over a year, and he was going against doctor's orders by not wearing spectacles. Everything I've read about Gibbs's personality suggests he was some sort of daredevil who liked to test himself just because he could. One of his colleagues described him as a pilot who rarely used maps and would do reckless things like flying under bridges or diving down really low in order to read the road signs. During his time with the London Symphony Orchestra, he was a practical joker who did things like bomb their tour bus with flour bags from his Tiger Moth biplane, and on one occasion, he released a bag of live grasshoppers during a performance. Oh, and I guess I should share the story about how he once burned his bridges with renowned conductor Herbert von Karajan. Karajan found fame in Germany and had even been a member of the Nazi Party before fleeing the country during World War II. When Karajan was conductor of the London Philharmonic Orchestra in 1956, Gibbs thought he was arrogant and unprofessional, and finally decided to call him out on his behavior after a performance in Boston where Karajan refused to acknowledge the audience and perform an encore. Now, there are many different versions of this story, but the most popular one is that Gibbs told Karajan, "I did not spend 4 years of my life fighting bastards like you to be insulted before our own allies like you did last evening." The point of this story is, Peter Gibbs did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, so if he wanted to take a reckless Christmas Eve flight off an unlit runway with a bad winter storm on the way, he would do so. I think the simplest explanation is that Gibbs just considered the whole thing to be a personal challenge, and since he had been drinking alcohol prior to his flight, he might not have been in the most rational state of mind. And unfortunately for him, this time, he may have taken a risk which cost him his life. While the Cessna was equipped with a radio, no one received any calls, but Gibbs did seem like the type of guy who wouldn't radio for help if something went wrong, especially if it was the result of an irresponsible decision on his part. But of course, even if the explanation for why Gibbs took the Cessna into the air is a simple one, the explanation for what actually happened to the plane and how Gibbs wound up dead on that hill seems a lot more complicated. I know the theory pushed forward by the fatal accident inquiry is that Gibbs crashed the Cessna into the Sound of Mull and swam to shore, but subsequently died of exposure on the hillside before he made it to safety. On the surface, that might seem like a logical explanation, as emerging from that water on a very cold December night certainly could have caused hypothermia, but there are a number of problems. The biggest issue is that if a crash like that occurred, what are the odds that Gibbs could have even survived long enough to make it to the hillside in the first place? When George Foster discovered the downed aircraft in the Sound of Mull in 1986, a lot of the details he provided made people believe this was Gibbs's missing Cessna. But then the Navy warships came across a downed aircraft at that approximate location 18 years later and identified it as a World War II-era Catalina. Now, we cannot be certain that the Catalina and the plane Foster found were the same aircraft, since some of the details didn't match up, such as the fact that the Catalina was missing only one wing, but Foster claimed the plane he saw was missing both wings. However, Foster did report seeing the correct registration number from the Cessna, G-AVTN, though there are still some issues. Foster apparently said the registration number was on the rudder, when in actuality, it was written on the Cessna's rear fuselage, a fact which is confirmed by photographs. So it's possible that Foster misremembered certain details or just saw them wrong in the murkiness of the water, which is somewhat supported by the fact that his photographs of the aircraft were too blurry to make out anything. But while we can't be certain this was the missing Cessna, one thing I'm fairly confident about is that there's no way Gibbs could have survived if he had been inside that particular plane when it crashed. And if by some miracle Gibbs did survive and made it to shore, it seems impossible that he could have done so without sustaining more serious injuries on his body. The fact that Foster described seeing broken wings, a broken wheel, a broken windscreen, and the engine being dislodged makes it sound like the crash was an extremely violent one. I seriously doubt that anyone who experienced something like that could have swam 500 meters to shore and walked 400 feet up a steep hill. One of the biggest reasons many people are skeptical that Gibbs was ever in the water is that there were no traces of salt water or marine microorganisms on his body or clothing. Even though rain would have touched his body if it had been lying on the hillside for 4 months, I really doubt it would have washed all traces of salt away. But another thing which lends credence to the idea that Gibbs was not inside the plane when it crashed is that he was still wearing the same clothing from the night he was last seen, which included some heavy flying boots. Swimming in water when you're dressed in heavy clothing and thick boots is incredibly difficult because it can weigh you down and would seriously lessen the chances of making a 500-meter trip to shore after a traumatic plane crash. But even if Gibbs somehow did make it to shore, the location where his body was found would have been incredibly difficult to reach. In 2014, author Alan J. Organ, who published a book about this case, decided to make an attempt to replicate the route Gibbs would have taken if he had crashed into the Sound of Mull and walked from the shoreline to the spot he was discovered 400 feet up the hill. Well, the hillside was very rough terrain, and after walking for about 40 minutes, Organ only managed to make it to the halfway point on the route before he gave up from exhaustion. And keep in mind, Organ was an experienced hill climber who walked this route in the daylight and did so without crashing his plane into the water and swimming 500 meters to shore beforehand. Compare that to Peter Gibbs, who was just about to turn 55 years old and would have had to walk this route on a dark, cold night while he was dripping wet after a traumatic accident. It just doesn't seem possible for him to have made it the full 400 feet. And there's also the question of why Gibbs would have even walked up the hill to begin with, as it involved crossing the road which led him back to the hotel. If Gibbs had just followed the road, he could have made it back to safety in a relatively short amount of time, so there's no reason for him to have trudged up the hillside. Mind you, it was pitch black outside, and Gibbs had just been involved in a plane crash, so it would have been very easy for him to become disoriented and head in the wrong direction. However, Gibbs's mental state at that time is completely irrelevant if it was physically impossible for him to reach the spot where his body was found in the first place. So now we'll talk about what I consider to be the most baffling aspect of this mystery, and that's the fact that Gibbs's body was not discovered on the hillside for 4 months. I know I've discussed numerous times on this podcast about how it's not uncommon for search parties to miss the body of a deceased victim. There are countless examples of cases where the remains of a missing victim are found years after the fact in the same area where they originally disappeared from because the initial search efforts overlooked them. But this particular case is different. For starters, it's not like Gibbs was skeletal remains by the time he was found, as his body was fully intact and in relatively good condition for someone who had supposedly been dead for 4 months. That hill had already been searched right after Gibbs disappeared and was pretty much used on a day-to-day basis by local shepherds and farmers, but no one saw his body at all until April. I mean, if this was a dense wooded area, that would be one thing, but it sounds like Gibbs's body was lying right out on the open on a hillside on top of a log, and it would be really difficult for that many people to overlook him for such a long amount of time. And there's also the fact that there were no traces of animal activity or predation on his body. One of the reasons people who go missing in nature are sometimes never found is because animals feed on the body and scavengers spread the remains around. This was not the case with Gibbs, even though he was supposedly there 4 months, and animals were known for frequenting that hillside. But of course, the biggest issue with believing Gibbs was alive at another location during those 4 months is that he was found wearing the exact same clothes he had on when he took off on Christmas Eve, including his heavy flying boots. I guess a potential explanation for why Gibbs wasn't found is that a lot of sleet started falling on Christmas Eve, and a winter storm hit the area for the next 72 hours, so perhaps Gibbs's body was simply concealed and preserved by snow for months until it melted in the spring. However, according to weather reports from that time period, the winter in that section of Scotland was relatively mild that year, and there was enough rainfall that it should have melted the snow and made Gibbs's body visible long before April. The medical examiner concluded that Gibbs was likely dead the entire time he was missing, but if that's the case, could his body have been at another location before it was placed on the hillside? Well, if someone did move Gibbs's body to the hill, the big question is, why? Of course, like I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest issues with believing that Gibbs was murdered is his cause of death was consistent with exposure, but I'm not exactly sure how they would have killed him. But supposing Gibbs died of exposure at another location, what would be the purpose of moving his body to that particular spot? Just walking the rough terrain on that hill is arduous enough, so I'm sure it would have been infinitely more difficult to carry or drag a dead body there. The other explanation which has been put forward for why Gibbs wound up there is that something went horribly wrong during the flight, which made him become desperate enough to jump out of the Cessna in midair. The unmanned plane then subsequently crashed into the water, while Gibbs died of exposure on that hill. As implausible as that may sound, Felicity Granger claimed that Gibbs told her he would throttle the engine back and jump to safety if anything went wrong. It's certainly possible that after Gibbs took the Cessna into the air, he was shocked to discover that he could not see the torches on the Glenforsa airfield's runway. And since the hotel had switched many of its lights off so they could get a better view of the takeoff, Gibbs may have had a hard time seeing it as well. As a result, Gibbs was unable to find his way back there, and it was too dark for him to perform a proper landing anywhere. Out of desperation, Gibbs decided to fly low over one of the mountainous areas and leaped out of the aircraft before it crashed into the Sound of Mull. With all the darkness, Gibbs may not have even known where he was when he made the jump, and before he could make it back to safety, the cold weather caused him to succumb to exposure. The biggest issue with this theory is that the only injury on Gibbs's body was the cut on his leg, and you'd think that someone who jumped out of an aircraft would have more serious injuries, such as broken bones. It seems very unlikely that Gibbs used a parachute, since none were ever found during the searches for him, and it doesn't sound like there were any parachutes on the plane to begin with. This theory would also depend on whether the aircraft George Foster saw underwater was the missing Cessna. He described both of the cockpit doors as being closed, and I think it would have been impossible for Gibbs to close the door behind him while he was desperately leaping out. But if that aircraft wasn't the Cessna, then Gibbs very well could have bailed before the Cessna crashed into the water and sank at another location where it is yet to be found. There's actually a really interesting article about this story at a blog called mysteryinksite.wordpress.com. The writer, Steve McGregor, has an extensive knowledge about flying and aircrafts and provides his own analysis about what he believes happened. McGregor leans towards the theory that Gibbs died of exposure after jumping out of the aircraft, though he includes this theory isn't 100% perfect. However, he claims that it's not unprecedented for someone to jump out of a moving aircraft onto land without sustaining any serious injuries. According to the Aircraft Crashes Records Office, between 1940 and 2008, there were 157 documented incidents of someone jumping or falling out of an aircraft without a parachute and surviving. In fact, some of these incidents took place at altitudes a lot higher than Gibbs probably would have been. One of them involved a tail gunner who jumped out of a burning plane at 17,000 feet during World War II and survived with nothing more than some bruises and a twisted knee. If someone could survive that, then I guess it's not impossible that Gibbs could have survived a similar jump. So let's say Gibbs was flying at low altitude over the top of the hill where he was found. He could have leaped out and been lucky enough to survive unscathed. Rather than walking 400 feet up the hill, Gibbs was actually walking down the hill towards the road, but before he made it, he died of exposure. While this happened, the Cessna subsequently crashed into the water and sank to the bottom without anybody seeing anything. Jumping out of a moving plane in mid-air is not the most rational course of action, but Peter Gibbs was not always the most rational person, and if he actually told Felicity Granger he was planning to do this if anything went wrong, then he certainly would have been capable of it. Of course, considering that the flight itself was pretty pointless to begin with, it's pretty insane that Gibbs would even consider that to be his contingency plan, especially when you consider that the plane didn't even belong to him to begin with. If Gibbs had survived, he might have found himself embroiled in a lawsuit with Ian Hamilton for destroying his aircraft, not to mention some legal hot water for doing this when his pilot's license was 1 year expired. Out of all the theories I've seen presented, the jumping out of the plane explanation does seem like one of the more plausible ones, but the biggest obstacle is believing that Gibbs's dead body could have been lying on that hill for 4 months without being seen. Without that major elephant in the room, this theory would fit the facts pretty well. Like I said in the intro, when you look at all the evidence, it's virtually impossible to form an airtight theory about this case, which makes 100% complete sense. Hell, the aliens abducted him theory is probably the one which makes the most sense, but if you're looking for a more rational explanation, I do think it's most likely that Gibbs bailed out of the aircraft before it sank somewhere, but got lost and disoriented in the pitch black darkness, and the weather eventually caused him to succumb to exposure. Anyway, that about wraps up our episode about the Great Mull Air Mystery. While I don't think anyone is actively investigating this case anymore, if by chance you have any information about the death of Peter Gibbs to suggest he was the victim of foul play, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, another special thanks to Alexandra Wasilica, the winner of our listener voiceover contest, for doing such a great job at narrating the opening. This has been a popular recurring monthly contest for our listeners, and if you've already entered this contest before, you are automatically eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter the contest and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail When Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line, Trail When Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already released some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this month we have a special bonus episode titled The Trail Went Hot, which examines some of the many cold cases which have been resolved in 2018. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take this moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are John M., Tara D., Claire S., Sarah L., Sheldon G., Ben S., and Suzanne W. Thank you all so much for your support. Also, just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board, the Sitcoms Online forum, and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Anyway, this marks our last Christmas-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold, and next week, on December 26th, we'll be closing off the year with a special Q&A episode. So I hope every one of you has a safe and happy holiday season, and will return to join us next week for the year's final episode of The Trail Went Cold.